The first shock was not a shouting match. It was not a headline. It was not even a public statement from Buckingham Palace. It was a room. A locked room, deep inside the palace system, where old records were said to have been pulled back into view. Not the pretty kind of royal history the public likes to imagine. Not wedding albums, not coronation notes, not polished family papers wrapped in tradition. These were the colder records. Internal logs. Private correspondence. Timelines. Security concerns. Quiet notes written when people in powerful places begin to worry. And once people began whispering about what was inside, the story around Prince Harry and Meghan Markle changed almost overnight. Let's talk about what really made this so explosive. Because the phrase that started moving through royal circles was simple, but heavy: the unseen files. According to palace whispers, media chatter, and the kind of stories that always slip through old institutions when trust breaks down, these files were said to contain a long trail of concerns stretching back to the moment Meghan Markle entered the royal orbit. Not one dramatic revelation, but a series of details that, when put together, painted a much darker picture than the public had ever been given. And for Prince Harry, if those whispers are even partly true, that may have been the moment everything cracked. This was not just gossip about a troubled marriage. This was gossip about betrayal, strategy, and the possibility that the whole story had been moving toward rupture much earlier than anyone knew. That is why it hit so hard. The world has watched Prince Harry for years as if he were living inside two lives at once. In one, he was the wounded son of the House of Windsor, still carrying grief, still carrying anger. Still trying to carve out a place for himself in an institution that often seemed too rigid to hold him gently. In the other, he became the man who left. The prince who crossed an ocean for love. The husband who made Meghan Markle the center of his loyalty, even when that choice tore his family in half. People can argue over whether he was brave, reckless, manipulated, or simply desperate to protect the woman he loved. But nobody can deny the scale of what he gave up. He did not just leave a job. He walked away from a life that had shaped every part of him. That is why the rumors around these files carry such force. Because if the files really suggest that plans were already in motion long before the public collapse, then the emotional heart of Harry's story starts to look very different. Suddenly the fairy tale has shadows in it. Suddenly the timeline matters. Suddenly old palace warnings do not sound so petty anymore. And that is exactly what has kept royal watchers, journalists, and former insiders circling this story with such intensity. What many people don't know is that royal households are obsessed with records. They do not survive generations by trusting memory alone. They document things. They note changes in tone. They log unusual behavior. They preserve discussions that seemed minor at the time but later become critical. That is how old institutions protect themselves. So when talk began that King Charles's inner circle had revisited a collection of archived material tied to the Sussex years, people paid attention. Not because palace files are glamorous. They are not. They are dull, bureaucratic, and often painfully dry. But dull papers can destroy people. A timeline can be more dangerous than a scandal. A memo can undo a love story. And one of the most repeated whispers surrounding these alleged files was that Meghan Markle's exit from the monarchy may not have been an emotional last resort at all. Some accounts claim that a high-level American public relations strategy had been discussed far earlier than the public ever realized. Not after things fell apart. Before. Not after the wedding. Before the wedding, according to the most dramatic version of these whispers. If true, that detail alone would be devastating. Because it would mean the split now known as Megxit was not simply the result of pressure, pain, and racism, as many have argued. It would mean there may have been planning beneath the public romance. Quiet preparation beneath the palace smiles. A route out carefully sketched, while the world was still being sold a beginning. That is the kind of detail that can ruin a man from the inside. And then came the second layer of rumor. The more disturbing one. Accounts from journalists and society insiders have suggested that certain private conversations inside the royal household may not have remained as private as senior figures believed. The whispers go further than ordinary leaking. They suggest that highly sensitive exchanges, including discussions held close to Queen Elizabeth's private rooms, may have been documented in ways that alarmed the palace once those patterns were noticed. No one can publicly prove that, at least not from what is known outside. But inside the gossip documentary machine that surrounds every major royal drama, that claim spread like fire. Because it does not sound like ordinary family conflict. It sounds like leverage. It sounds like memory being turned into power. It sounds like trust becoming a weapon. And then there was the third claim, the one that made the whole thing feel less like a marriage story and more like a state concern. Some whispers say there were quiet contacts with outside interests, even foreign-linked channels, that clashed with what the monarchy considered safe or acceptable. Again, these are claims, not confirmed public findings. But the fact that they entered the conversation at all changed the mood around the story. It was no longer just, did Harry and Meghan hurt the family? It became, did they cross a line the crown could not ignore? That is where King Charles reportedly stopped thinking only as a father, and started thinking as the sovereign. Because fathers can ache. Fathers can forgive. Fathers can wait for a son to come home angry and tired and wounded. A king does not always have that luxury. A king is trained to ask a colder question: what threatens the institution, and how far must the institution go to protect itself? That is why this story feels bigger than another chapter in the long war between the Sussexes and the palace. It carries a different chill. It suggests that what looked like a family breakdown may also have been, in the eyes of palace loyalists, a calculated dismantling of trust. And somewhere in Montecito, according to the most painful version of this story, Prince Harry was left staring at the possibility that the woman he gave everything for may have been following a map he did not fully understand. That possibility alone would explain the phrase people have started using. Total collapse. Not public collapse. Not tabloid collapse. Private collapse. The kind that happens when a person's whole past suddenly rearranges itself in their head, and every sacrifice begins to feel different. To understand why these rumors have landed with such force, you have to go back to the beginning, before the documentaries, before the interviews, before the lawyers and the memoirs and the war of public narratives. Back to when Meghan Markle first appeared beside Prince Harry, and the world rushed to name the story before it had fully formed. At the start, it looked almost perfect. Harry, the restless prince, still carrying old pain, still half inside the royal machine and half outside it. Meghan, the American actress, confident, modern, bright, and already comfortable in front of cameras. Together, they looked like a bridge into a newer world. A monarchy that had long struggled with image suddenly had a couple who seemed able to speak directly to a younger global audience. For a while that worked. Crowds loved them. Headlines swelled. The wedding became a global event. St. George's Chapel glowed with all the old royal symbols, but around it there was something else too, a sense that the House of Windsor was trying to look open, warmer, more current. Meghan Markle was not just entering the family. She was being presented, at least in public, as proof that the family could evolve. But behind all that beauty and celebration, some people say concern had already started. Not concern in the loud, dramatic sense. More in the quiet palace way. A look held too long after a meeting. A note made after an awkward exchange. Staff conversations that turned more careful than usual. There were whispers that Meghan did not simply want to fit into the system. She wanted to shape it quickly, and on her own terms. That did not automatically make her a villain. Plenty of people marry into rigid families and find them suffocating. Plenty of women, especially women entering old male institutions, get labeled difficult when they are simply direct. That is part of why this story remains so divisive. Every accusation has a counter-argument. Every criticism has a political charge wrapped around it. Still, the pattern is what keeps returning. Accounts from people who watched the Sussex period closely say tension built early around staff, access, hierarchy, and control of image. Meghan was said to be highly aware of presentation from the beginning. Harry, deeply protective and increasingly suspicious of palace motives, reportedly backed her with growing intensity. Together they became not just a married couple, but a pressure point. The old guard noticed. What many people don't know is that royal households can tolerate eccentricity more easily than they tolerate unpredictability. Affairs have happened. Feuds have happened. Jealousy, status anxiety, private meltdowns, and messy marriages have all happened before. But when insiders begin to sense strategy under the emotion, the mood changes. Suddenly every disagreement feels less domestic and more structural. That seems to be what happened here. There were stories of friction with staff that did not fade but deepened. Stories of private disagreements later appearing, in altered form, in public commentary. Stories that Meghan and Harry were not merely unhappy within the system, but already imagining life beyond it in ways that made people inside the palace uneasy. At the time, those concerns could still be brushed aside. After all, Harry was in love. And love, especially when a man believes he is saving the person he loves from a hostile world, makes criticism very hard to hear. Every warning begins to sound like sabotage. Every attempt to slow things down feels like cruelty. Every caution from family looks like control. That was one of the great emotional engines of the whole saga. Harry did not just love Meghan Markle. He believed he had to defend her against forces he saw as cold, racist, class-bound, and unwilling to protect her. Once that belief hardened, it changed everything. Palace concern no longer looked like institutional caution. It looked like persecution. That is how trust began to die. And while the public still saw hand-holding, smiling tours, and the glamorous beginning of a new chapter, some inside royal circles say another chapter was already writing itself. One built on grievances, exit routes, and external advice. Some now claim that Meghan understood very early how powerful the Sussex brand could become outside palace walls. Again, that is a claim, not a settled fact. But it is one of the core ideas inside the rumor storm now surrounding the so-called unseen files. The warning signs, according to this version of events, were there. A few people reportedly saw them. A few tried to raise them. But Harry was no longer in a state where warnings could reach him. Unlike Prince William, who had spent his whole life preparing to survive the institution by mastering it, Harry often seemed to survive by resisting it. That difference mattered. William leaned toward duty, structure, and caution. Harry leaned toward feeling, instinct, and loyalty to the immediate emotional truth of the moment. That made him more relatable in many ways. It may also have made him easier to pull away. By the time the Sussexes stepped back from royal duties, the split felt sudden to the public but not to those who say they had been watching the pattern from inside. For them, this was not an explosion out of nowhere. It was a long fuse finally reaching the flame. And if the rumors about pre-wedding planning are true, then the fracture began even earlier than most people can bear to admit. That is the cruelest part. Because it means that while Harry thought he was building a future, someone else may already have been designing an exit. The moment everything changed was not cinematic in the way people imagine royal drama should be. There was no tiara thrown across a room. No screaming under chandeliers. No newspaper photograph catching a face in mid-collapse. It was quieter than that. And much worse. According to the accounts now circulating through royal commentary circles, the real crisis began when archived records were reviewed alongside later events and timelines. On their own, the pieces may have looked harmless. A conversation here. A date there. An external contact. A note from staff. A concern that once felt too small to matter. But laid side by side, people say, the pattern sharpened. And once it sharpened, Prince Harry could not unsee it. One alleged revelation was that American planning around the Sussex brand may have started far earlier than the official emotional breakdown with the palace. That matters because it touches the most sensitive question in the whole saga. Did Harry and Meghan leave because they had no choice, or because leaving had always been part of a larger design? That question is brutal. Because for Harry, the answer reaches into every sacrifice he made. His family. His military identity. His position in the monarchy. His standing with the public. His brother. His father. Even his homeland, in a deep emotional sense. He burned through all of it for the life he chose with Meghan Markle. So what happens if he now believes the future he fought for was not purely a shared dream, but a carefully managed strategy? That is where the idea of collapse becomes painfully believable. Then there were the whispers about recordings. This remains one of the darkest elements of the whole story because it goes beyond ordinary royal leaking. People in these circles have long accepted that private conversations often drift outward, especially in famous families where courtiers, journalists, and social connections all overlap. But hidden devices, or private conversations being captured for later use, is something else. It suggests planning. It suggests collection. It suggests a person entering sacred spaces, hearing intimate words, and storing them not as memories but as assets. Whether that happened exactly as rumored is still unclear from the public's side. But the mere existence of that suspicion would have terrified the palace. Because monarchy runs on ritual, yes, but underneath ritual it runs on controlled privacy. Rooms have to mean something. The Queen's space had to mean something. Trust around those spaces had to mean something. Once that line is thought to have been crossed, people at the top stop reacting emotionally and start reacting defensively. That appears to be what happened around King Charles. By this stage, according to reports and commentary, he was no longer dealing with the Sussex issue as a difficult family wound. He was dealing with it as a sovereign risk. The language around the matter reportedly hardened. Advisors were consulted. Quiet discussions began around final separation and what formal steps remained available if the institution concluded that the breach could never be repaired. At the same time, Harry's own position seemed to grow more tragic. Because he was not just dealing with public embarrassment. He was confronting the possibility that the story he had told himself for years might not survive contact with the record. And once that kind of doubt enters a man's mind, it does not stay in one place. It spreads backward through memory. A warning from William begins to sound different. A tense silence from King Charles begins to sound different. A staff complaint that once felt hostile begins to sound different. Every argument with the palace. Every interview. Every furious public stand. Every bridge he burned in Meghan's defense starts to return to him carrying a new and terrible question. What if they saw something he refused to see? That does not automatically make Harry innocent. And that is part of what gives this story its sharp edge. Many are questioning how much he knew. Some believe he was a full partner in the long game, and is only now shaken because the record has become harder to control. Others think he was emotionally trapped by love, grievance, and a lifetime of unresolved pain, and that he became the easiest person in the room to steer. Both versions continue to circulate. Both versions attract believers. And somewhere between them sits the image that now defines this crisis: Prince Harry in Montecito, isolated from the family he once knew, staring at a reality that no longer feels stable. If that image sounds dramatic, it is because royal collapse is rarely loud at first. It starts in private. It starts when a person looks at their own life and realizes the order of events may not mean what they once thought it meant. It starts when a husband asks whether he was standing beside his wife in a shared rebellion, or serving as the emotional fuel for a plan larger than himself. And when that question lands, there is no palace spokesman in the world who can soften it. By the time the full rumor picture settled into place, the emotional damage had already been done. The public, as always, divided itself into tribes. One side saw another cruel chapter in the palace's long war against Meghan Markle. For them, these stories about hidden planning, recordings, and foreign links sounded like the kind of elite retaliation powerful institutions produce when they lose control of the narrative. In that reading, Meghan was not the architect of betrayal. She was the target of a desperate attempt to discredit her. The other side saw something very different. They saw confirmation. Confirmation that the fairy tale had always been unstable. Confirmation that Meghan understood image, power, and leverage far better than Harry did. Confirmation that Prince William's caution, King Charles's distance, and palace staff unease were not signs of coldness alone, but signs that some people inside the system believed danger had arrived in elegant clothes and perfect timing. That split is unlikely to disappear. But what matters in this story is not just which side the public chooses. It is what these whispers have done to the emotional meaning of Harry's journey. Because for years, he cast himself as the man who saw the truth before anyone else did. The man who understood his wife, understood the media, understood the palace, and was willing to lose everything for a more honest life. That self-image was the spine of his post-royal identity. If the unseen files rumors have broken anything, they may have broken that image first. And once a man loses faith in the story he told himself, collapse becomes less about scandal and more about identity. That is why King Charles's role matters so much in the final stage of this drama. By many accounts, Charles spent years caught between two instincts. The father who did not want to lose another son, and the sovereign who understood that a monarchy cannot survive repeated internal breaches without drawing hard lines. People close to royal culture often say that one of the saddest truths about the crown is this: it teaches its heirs that family feeling must sometimes kneel before institutional survival. If that is where Charles now stands, then his next moves would not be sentimental ones. They would be final ones. This is where the whispers become especially severe. Some claim the palace has already begun considering a point-of-no-return approach to the Sussex problem. Not another round of patience. Not another attempt at quiet reconciliation. A formal closing down of what remains: titles, honorary links, unresolved constitutional questions, and the last symbolic threads connecting Harry and Meghan to the heart of the monarchy. Whether Parliament would ever be drawn into such a step remains part of the speculation. But the fact that this possibility is being discussed at all shows how far the relationship has fallen. Because there was a time when this family breakdown could still be described as sad. Now, in some circles, it is described as dangerous. That is an extraordinary shift. And for Meghan Markle, the picture remains fiercely contested. To some, she is the wronged outsider who entered a hostile dynasty and refused to be crushed by it. To others, she is the most effective modern operator the royals failed to read in time, a woman who understood that narrative power could be more valuable than palace approval, and who moved accordingly. The truth may be more complicated than either side wants. It usually is. Human beings are rarely only one thing. Ambition and hurt can exist in the same person. Love and strategy can live in the same marriage. A person can feel sincerely wounded while also calculating the best use of that wound. And in royal life, where image and feeling are always tangled together, those contradictions become even harder to separate. That may be why this story refuses to die. It is not just about Harry and Meghan. It is about what happens when private longing collides with ancient power. It is about what happens when a man raised inside duty decides that love matters more, only to discover that love itself may have had its own structure, its own ambition, its own timing. For Prince Harry, that may be the real tragedy here. Not simply that he lost his place in the House of Windsor. Not simply that he fought with Prince William, drifted from King Charles, and ended up far from the country that once defined him. It is that he may now be trapped between two humiliations. If the palace was right, then he sacrificed everything for a story he did not fully understand. If the palace was wrong, then he is still stuck in a war that has already devoured almost every bond he had. Either way, the cost is enormous. And that is why this story lands with such weight. Because underneath the tiaras, the titles, the California mansions, the global interviews, and the palace walls, the core of it is painfully human. A son at war with his father. A brother cut off from his brother. a husband who may have confused rescue with destiny, a wife seen by some as brave, by others as calculating, and by almost everyone as impossible to ignore. These stories provide insight into something people often forget about power. It does not erase human weakness. It magnifies it. Pride becomes disaster faster. Love becomes risk faster. Trust, once broken, becomes a permanent ghost in every room that follows. And if the unseen files really did force old secrets back into the light, then the final question is not only whether Meghan Markle betrayed the crown, or whether Prince Harry helped her do it. It is whether Harry was ever truly holding the pen in his own story at all. Because if he was not, then the saddest image in this whole royal saga is not Meghan walking away from duty, and not King Charles hardening into the sovereign. It is Prince Harry realizing too late that the bridges behind him are ash, the doors ahead of him are narrowing. And the version of love he defended so fiercely may have been built on terms he never fully saw. That is the kind of truth that does not make noise when it arrives. It simply leaves a man sitting in silence, with nothing left to argue with except his own memory.